So I'm Swift. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Major League Hacking. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about budgeting. Going to give you a pretty high-level overview. This talk's only about 10 minutes. I'm trying to keep it a little bit under there so I can answer some questions. We'll be sending out a bunch of resources at the end of the event with some sample budgets and these things in more detail. So there's going to be a lot of numbers I'm going to throw at you, but keep in mind we'll send them out afterwards. So I mentioned I'm Swift. I'm CEO and co-founder of Major League Hacking. I've been involved in student hackathons since the second ever student hackathon. I've organized a ton of these events. I've sponsored them. I've done pretty much every role you could possibly imagine. So I know a thing or two about them. Formerly, I ran another company called Hacker League, which was a platform for hackathons, and I used to be a developer evangelist over at SendGrid and an engineer before that. So let's talk about budgeting. The first question, before we go into some specifics around it, here's a little bit of an overview over what I'm going to cover. First off, I'm going to talk about why it's important to budget. Obviously, budgeting is a core concept of anything involving money, but we run into a lot of student organizers who are just getting started with their events. They might not even have a budget, and maybe they don't understand why it's important to actually have one. So we'll talk about why it's important. We'll go over some basic terminology around budgets, things that you need to know to actually construct one. In the third part, we'll actually walk through some of the numbers around creating a budget for a student hackathon specifically, and as well as some just general budgeting tips. Fourth, we'll go over some pro tips that I've seen along the way and some common pitfalls I see people run into all the time. And finally, we'll have some time for Q&A. So let's jump right into it. Why is it important to budget? Why should you even have a budget at all? Well, in truth, you need to know how much it costs to actually throw your hackathon. So a lot of people come up with this idea, they're going to organize an event, but they don't actually even know how much a hackathon costs to run. And in truth, student hackathons in particular run a huge gambit of prices. On the lowest end, I've seen events being put on for like $500. And on the high end, there are events that have hundreds of thousands of dollars in budget to actually put on the event. There's actually no way to know how much it's going to cost you to put on your event unless you actually sit down and think about how much each thing costs and create a budget. Also, a lot of the time your school will want to know, especially if you're running the event through a school club. If you have an advisor or somebody in the faculty who is responsible for approving your event, they're going to want to know how much money you need to actually put it on. A lot of the time schools will backstop the actual event budget, so if you can't actually raise all the money, they'll be responsible for paying your bills in the event you can't. So they want to know how much they're on the hook for. This might also be true if you have advisors or other people who are helping you with sponsorship or even if you're working for MLH. So another question you might want to know is how much did you charge sponsors? John, my co-founder, is going to give you a little talk about sponsorship after this. You obviously need sponsors to be able to put on the events that you're putting on for student hackathons. How much should you actually charge them? How much should your tiers cost? How much do you need to raise in total? You actually don't know the answer to that question unless you know how much money you need to actually put on the event. So super important for that too. And the other question that you want to be able to answer is, how should you actually spend that money? Is it wise to spend $50,000 on t-shirts? Well, it depends on what your total budget is. If you can't afford food after that, then probably not. So having a budget will help you understand that. Let's go into some core concepts of budgeting. There's three that I'm going to go over: revenue, expenses, and cost per attendee. These are the three basic things I think you need to know in order to actually understand and interpret a budget. So revenue is the first one. Basically, this is your income. This is your cash money. In the example of student hackathons, most of the time, student hackathons are funded through sponsorship from companies. Other ways you could receive money might be like ticket sales if you're running a conference, or I know that there's some events that have done crowdfunding before. But basically, all of the money that comes in, you can count as your revenue. So this is your income. Expenses, these are the things you actually have to shell out cash for. This is everything like food, swag, maybe rentals for equipment that you need. This might be your costs for getting people to the event through travel reimbursements. Anything you actually have to pay for your expenses. And then there's this one important number to really focus on too. It's cost per attendee. Basically, you want to know how much it costs for every attendee who's going to come to your event. So in order to calculate that, you take the total cost of the event, all of the money you need to actually put it on, and you divide it by the total number of attendees. For you, as an event organizer, you want to make that number as low as possible. So if you can put on an event for $1 per attendee, that's a really good number. If it costs you $1,000 per attendee, that might not be as good, right? And what that number should be, John will go into some details around that in a little bit, but just keep in mind, as an event organizer, it is in your best interest to minimize that number as much as possible. So let's walk through actually creating a budget. So how do we do this? Well, for student hackathons, there's a couple of things that you need for the most part. And not all of these are essential. Hammer later on will go into some details around which of these are essential versus not essential. But I'm going to assume that you are the generic student hackathon, and these are your core costs. So food and snacks, shirts and swag, prizes, venue, transportation, and miscellaneous. So let's start off with food. We have this thing at MLH that we call the rule of 7. Basically what that means is that your meals should come out to equal about $7 per person per meal on average. Breakfast might be a little bit cheaper, dinner might be a little bit more expensive, but you really want them to average out to be about $7 a person. For snacks and drinks, you can assume that it'll cost you about $10 per person for a 36-hour event, 3 days. It's a little bit less than that for a 24-hour event, but basically that assumes that you have actual snacks and drinks out during the entire course of the event, as well as maybe a midnight snack too. So that's your food. The next thing you might want to calculate for is shirts and swag. Shirts are usually anywhere between $4 and $10. There's a number of factors that go into that. Hammer will go into some more detail, but the ones that you should keep in mind are number of places and colors that you're printing, as well as the quality of the shirts or swag. Obviously, there are things that are cheaper than t-shirts, like pens or buttons and stickers. But generally speaking, I usually advise events to budget about $10 per person for whatever swag they're going to give. Prizes. This one is a huge variable. Back in the early days of hackathons, people used to give away huge cash prizes. At MLH, we actually think that huge cash prizes are not that great. We actually advise events to aim for experiential or non-monetary prizes. These are things that encourage people to keep hacking, right? So giving somebody an Arduino that they can use at their next hackathon is a lot better than giving them $1,000 that they end up spending on rent, right? It encourages them to keep going to events, encourages them to keep exploring, and encourages them to keep learning. Another thing you can give away that is a good prize is experiential things that you can't just normally get. So maybe a trip to go to the movies with you and 20 of your friends, or like a trip to one of your sponsors' HQs. Those are experiences that money really can't buy, and they often end up being a lot cheaper than cash prizes. On average, I say that if you're, depending on the size of the event, you usually don't want to be budgeting more than a couple $1,000s for prizes. And honestly, some things like trophies or like custom things that you can get made or fabricated on Etsy are like a lot cheaper than you expect. Next thing you might need is venue costs. So venue costs are the single most variable cost for organizing a hackathon. In the best case, venue, Wi-Fi, and production are all free. As a student, you should start by going to your university and try to get all those things without paying for them. I promise you that if you can't get them for free, they will be the largest single cost on your budget. Venues can run anywhere from $1,000 or $500 on the low end, all the way up into the tens of thousands of dollars just for a venue for a couple of days. And Wi-Fi, same thing. It can be anywhere from like free if your school's providing it to $50,000 to $60,000 depending on how much bandwidth and the type of network you actually need. So optimize your venue costs. You want to make sure you can get it for free. Hopefully, if you can't, I can't honestly give you advice on this one on how much it should cost because it's going to really depend on the kind of venue you have. Renting out a co-working space like this one is a lot more cost effective than renting out a convention center, right? Like convention centers usually cost lots and lots of money. That's why not a lot of student hackathons happen in convention centers. The next thing you might need is transportation. I have a whole workshop on this. We're actually not covering transportation today during the workshops, but there's a video lecture that I'll send out the link to that covers it in more detail. A lot of events use charter buses to get students there. The average charter bus costs about $3,300 per bus. When you're talking about travel reimbursements for gas or for train tickets and things like that, they can be a lot cheaper. The most expensive kind of travel reimbursement is flights, and they always are. So if you can avoid paying for flights, that'll definitely help you save a lot of money. Basically, if you think about this, an average charter bus holds about 56 people, so it ends up being like a little less than $100 per person when you do that this way. The next thing you might have is miscellaneous expenses. This is everything from marketing to supplies, printing, stickers, tips for the drivers, emergency food, pretty much anything that's not covered in those basic categories. For these things, it really depends. Marketing might be things like Facebook ads, like those can run you a couple $100s. Marketing can also be free, meaning like you can just go around to classrooms and like yell at people and tell them to come to your event. So it really depends on how much you're going to invest in that. Honestly, if you have the budget, investing in some Facebook ads or like doing a social campaign can be a good thing. I wouldn't break the bank on it for sure, so I wouldn't budget more than a couple $100s for that at most. Supplies, that's anything from like maybe you need pens for people to sign waivers, or you need I don't know, like cups or like utensils that for some reason your vendors aren't providing. Again, not a very expensive thing. You shouldn't budget a ton for it, but this is really going to depend on what your vendors are providing or what your school provides. Printing, if you need to print waivers or signs, things like that, they can be pretty cheap or pretty expensive depending on how you do it. Again, always go through your school. It's going to be a lot cheaper. Stickers are pretty cheap. Tips for drivers, you can assume a couple $100s as well. And emergency food, if you run out of food during the event, you want to be able to pay for food, so budget for a little bit of extra pizza maybe. So those are the basics of budgeting. Again, I'll send out all that information afterwards so you'll have it. I know there was a lot there. Let's dive into some pitfalls and pro tips that I've seen. So always budget high. I cannot tell you how much better it is to have extra money left over at the end than not enough. I promise you that you'll save a lot of hair. You're not going to rip it out at the end, and you'll also be a lot happier. So always budget more than you think you need. It's a lot easier to cut things from the budget that way too, and again, very much less stressful. Not understanding payment cycles. This one is something I run into probably twice a semester. Basically, you go out, you're raising sponsorship, you get a company to agree to pay you, and you assume that when they say, yes, we're going to pay you, the check will be in the bank the next day. In truth, companies have these things called payment cycles, which could be anywhere from the same day to 90 to 120 days after they sign the agreement. So if you're not signing your sponsors 3 months out, you can expect that the check might not arrive for several weeks. When you're negotiating with sponsors, you should always ask what the payment cycle is, and you should keep this in mind for your budget. There are certain things like paying for like venue costs or paying for like maybe some food that you can defer until after the event and pay after the event is over, and that can help with payment cycles. Build an emergency fund into your budget. I promise you that when you get to the point where you're a couple days out from the event and you're like, oh my God, we're completely over budget, what are we going to do? This will be the first thing you cut if you have it, but having an emergency budget that you can reallocate later or you can use when things pop up during the event is a really, really good idea. I usually recommend that people set aside about 10% of their total budget when they estimate this. All this stuff is at guide.mlh.io, as well as some sample budgets that you can check out. Again, we're going to send out all these resources after the event. But that's the basics of budgeting. Anybody have any questions?
Yes. I don't know if it's related right now, but with regards to supplies, do you guys do like whiteboards and like markers and like that? Do you go out and buy like whiteboards and roll them in?
Totally. So the question is, in terms of like whiteboards or like supplies like that people can maybe do like brainstorming on, do we buy them, or like what do we do to acquire those? So Hammer will talk a little bit about this during his logistics talk, but basically there's two approaches. So three approaches. One, you can get it for free from your school, which is always the optimal one. If that's ever an option, do that. Just if you have that option, please do it. The other way is rentals. So you can go to companies who rent furniture or other like creative things that you can have, like whiteboards. Usually those will cost like a couple $100s to rent. It's a lot cheaper than buying them. Problem is you got to return them at the end. So it's cheaper up front, but obviously the third option is buying it, which is a little bit more expensive. If you do buy it and you do run multiple events and use it at those events, you'll save money over time. But it really depends on like how much money you have in your budget. Like honestly, if you're over budget and you need to cut money, like it's way more effective to rent it than buy it. But really, again, it depends on like where you are with your budget for that. Other questions? Dave? Yeah, so the question is like, oftentimes MLH makes jokes about not having travel reimbursements. What's the deal with that? So in that case, Nick was referring to a survey that we sent out where we asked people what the things were they needed to attend a hackathon. A lot of people think they need travel reimbursements in order to attend a hackathon. So basically, this is rooted in the history of hackathons. If you roll back the clock to 2010, like student hackathons used to happen maybe once every month. These days, on our busiest weekend, we run 9 simultaneous events in just the US. So like, there's a lot more going on. Travel reimbursements will be a huge cost if you do them. I promise you that like food seems like it would be a lot, but it's not actually anything compared to travel reimbursements. John's laughing because we're organizing an event right now. We're doing travel reimbursements and we're struggling through this ourselves. But in truth, if you can avoid paying for travel, you should do it. The truth is, like, while a lot of people think they need travel reimbursements, if the events are closer to them and they're able to go and they're incentivized to go with the right things, they will show up. But the general advice is travel reimbursements should be the first thing you cut and the last thing that you worry about. Yes? Okay, so the question is it expected for you to pay for judges or speakers or volunteer transportation? It depends. Most of the time we recommend you pull your judges, your volunteers, your mentors from your local community. So hopefully they're coming from the nearby area and you shouldn't have to pay for their travel. There are rare occasions when somebody might have like a speaker fee or something where they to come out. Again, usually we recommend when you're organizing a hackathon, start with the basics, right? You should assume that you want to hit MVH, the minimum viable hackathon. So you want to raise enough money to actually put on the event, right? If you have extra money, then you can use that stuff for things like speaker fees or getting people out. It's a nice thing to do, for sure. It's a nice gesture, but is it required? Probably not. Your judges, your mentors, your volunteers are getting just as much out of your event as you're getting out of them oftentimes. Other questions? Cool. Well, thank you very much for taking the time, everybody. I hope you got something out of this.